Change is often seen as something external, a shift in circumstance, a new opportunity, a different direction. But the real resistance to change does not come from the outside. It comes from within, from the patterns of thinking that have been built over time. Most people assume they want change. They speak about it. They plan for it. They imagine a different version of their life. But when the moment comes to act, something pulls them back. A hesitation, a delay, a quiet resistance that feels difficult to explain. This resistance is not random. It is the result of familiarity. The mind is designed to preserve what is known, not because what is known is always beneficial, but because it is predictable. And what is predictable feels safe, even when that safety comes at the cost of growth. Over time, repeated thoughts create a sense of identity. A person begins to see themselves in a certain way. They begin to expect certain outcomes. They begin to operate within a familiar range of behavior. And this range becomes their comfort zone, not because it is comfortable in the traditional sense, but because it is known, because it has been experienced repeatedly, because it does not introduce uncertainty. When change is introduced, it challenges this familiarity. It disrupts the pattern. It introduces something unknown, and the mind responds to the unknown with caution. It begins to generate thoughts designed to maintain the current state. Thoughts such as, "This may not work. This could lead to failure. This is not the right time." These thoughts are not always loud or obvious. They often appear subtle, reasonable, even logical. But their function is the same: to preserve what is familiar, to prevent movement into uncertainty. This is why resistance to change often feels justified. The thoughts supporting it seem valid. They appear to be protecting you. But in many cases, they are simply protecting the pattern. A pattern that may no longer serve you. A pattern that keeps you within a limited range of experience. A pattern that prevents expansion. This is the hidden force behind resistance. Not a lack of ability, not a lack of opportunity, but a deeply ingrained pattern of thinking that prioritizes familiarity over growth. And because this pattern has been repeated over time, it feels natural. It feels like part of who you are. But it is not fixed. It is learned, and anything learned can be changed. But before it can be changed, it must be understood. You must begin to see how the mind maintains what is familiar, how it generates resistance when change is introduced, how it uses thought to preserve the current state. This awareness is the first step, because once you see the mechanism, it no longer operates unnoticed. And once it is no longer unnoticed, it begins to lose its power. You begin to recognize resistance not as a signal to stop, but as a sign that something new is possible, that you are moving beyond what has been repeated, that you are stepping outside of the pattern. And it is in this space that change begins. As you begin to observe this resistance more closely, you start to notice that it follows a pattern. It does not appear randomly. It shows up at specific moments, moments when you are about to do something different, moments when you are about to step beyond what is familiar, moments when growth is possible, and instead of supporting that movement, the mind introduces hesitation. It begins to present reasons to stay where you are, reasons that often sound practical, that sound responsible, that sound like careful thinking. But when examined, they share a common purpose. They delay action. They maintain the current state. This is because the mind associates familiarity with safety, even if that familiarity includes frustration, limitation, or dissatisfaction. Because those experiences are known, they have been navigated before. They do not introduce uncertainty. Change, on the other hand, introduces variables, unknown outcomes, unpredictable results, and the mind interprets this as risk. So it responds accordingly. It generates thoughts designed to minimize that risk, thoughts that encourage caution, thoughts that emphasize potential failure, thoughts that magnify uncertainty. These thoughts are not always dramatic. They are often subtle, a quiet suggestion to wait, a slight doubt about timing, a small hesitation that feels insignificant. But these small moments accumulate. They influence decisions. They shape behavior. They determine whether action is taken or avoided. And over time, they reinforce the same pattern. A person remains where they are. not because they cannot move forward, but because the resistance has been followed repeatedly. This is how stagnation forms, not through a single decision, but through a series of small choices that favor familiarity over change. Each time the resistance is obeyed, it becomes stronger. Each time action is delayed, the pattern is reinforced. And eventually, the idea of change itself begins to feel distant, difficult, unrealistic. But this perception is not based on reality. It is based on repetition, on a pattern that has been followed without question. And once you begin to see this, something shifts. You begin to recognize resistance as a predictable response, not as a signal to stop, but as a sign that you are approaching something new, something unfamiliar, something that has the potential to expand your experience. And this recognition changes how you respond. Instead of immediately accepting the thought, you pause, you question it, you ask whether it is guiding you forward or holding you in place. And in that moment, you create a choice that did not exist when the pattern was automatic, and it is within that choice that change becomes possible. As you continue to move forward, something becomes more noticeable. The resistance is not only present when you are about to take action. It also appears when you begin to imagine a different outcome. Even the idea of change can trigger it. You may begin to think about doing something new, and almost immediately, a counterthought appears. A reason why it may not work. A reminder of past attempts. A quiet suggestion that staying where you are might be better. This happens quickly, often without being recognized. But when you begin to observe it, a pattern becomes clear. For every forward thought, there is a balancing thought. A thought that pulls you back toward what is familiar. This is not coincidence. It is a stabilizing mechanism. The mind is constantly trying to maintain equilibrium, to keep you within a known range of experience, because that range feels predictable, and predictability reduces uncertainty. But this stability comes at a cost. It limits movement. It restricts expansion. It keeps you operating within the same boundaries, even when those boundaries are no longer serving you. Over time, this creates a sense of being stuck, a feeling that despite effort, progress is slow or inconsistent. But the issue is not effort, it is direction. Each time a forward thought is followed by a backward one, and the backward one is accepted, the pattern is reinforced. The movement stops, the action is delayed, the opportunity passes. And the mind registers this as confirmation. Confirmation that staying where you are is the safer option. But what is actually happening is repetition, a repeated cycle of approach and retreat, initiation and hesitation, movement and withdrawal. And this cycle becomes familiar. It becomes expected. It becomes part of how you operate. Until eventually it no longer feels like resistance. It feels like reality. It feels like the natural limit of what is possible. But once you begin to see this cycle clearly, something changes. You recognize that the second thought is not necessarily more accurate. It is simply more familiar. It is part of the pattern, and once you recognize that, you begin to question it. You begin to ask whether it deserves to guide your decision, whether it is protecting you or holding you back. And in that moment of questioning, the cycle is interrupted. You no longer move automatically from forward to backward. You pause. You evaluate. You decide. And that decision changes the outcome. Because instead of retreating, you continue. Instead of stopping, you move. Instead of reinforcing the pattern, you begin to break it. And this is where change begins to take hold, not in a dramatic shift, but in a repeated interruption of what once felt automatic. Each interruption weakens the pattern, each continuation strengthens something new, and over time, the balance begins to shift. Forward movement becomes more natural, resistance becomes less dominant, and the mind begins to adapt to a new pattern, one that supports change rather than preventing it. As this process continues, you begin to notice that resistance does not only come from fear of failure, it also comes from attachment to identity. The way you see yourself plays a significant role in how you respond to change. Over time, repeated thoughts and behaviors create a sense of who you are. You begin to define yourself through patterns. What you do, what you avoid, what you expect. And these patterns form an identity that feels stable, predictable, familiar. But when change is introduced, it does not only challenge behavior. It challenges identity. It asks you to step outside of the version of yourself that has been reinforced over time. And this creates tension, because the mind is not only trying to preserve safety, it is trying to preserve consistency. It wants your actions to match your identity, even if that identity is limiting, even if it no longer reflects what you are capable of becoming. This is why change can feel uncomfortable even when it is positive, even when it leads to growth, because it requires you to act in ways that do not align with the current version of yourself. It requires you to do things that feel unfamiliar, to make decisions that do not fit the pattern. And when this happens, the mind responds with resistance. It introduces thoughts that pull you back into alignment with the existing identity. Thoughts such as, "This is not who you are. This is not what you normally do. This does not feel right." These thoughts are not random. They are designed to maintain consistency, to keep your actions aligned with your past. But growth requires a break in that alignment. It requires you to act differently, to step outside of the pattern, to behave in ways that feel new. And this is where awareness becomes critical. Because once you recognize that resistance is tied to identity, you begin to see it differently. You no longer interpret it as a sign that something is wrong. You begin to see it as a sign that something is changing, that you are moving beyond the current version of yourself, that you are expanding into something new. And this shift in perspective changes how you respond. Instead of retreating, you continue. Instead of questioning the action, you question the resistance. You begin to ask whether the identity you are holding on to still serves you, whether it reflects who you want to become. And in asking these questions, you begin to loosen its hold. You create space for a new identity to form, one that is not built on repetition of the past, but on deliberate choice in the present. And as this new identity begins to take shape, resistance starts to lose its influence, because there is less to protect, less to preserve, and more to explore. And this is where change begins to accelerate, not because resistance disappears, but because it no longer controls your direction. As you begin to move through this resistance more consciously, something important starts to shift. You realize that resistance is not something to eliminate. It is something to understand, because resistance is not the problem. Following it without question is, the moment you begin to see resistance as a pattern rather than a command, you change your relationship with it. It no longer feels absolute. It becomes something you can observe, something you can evaluate, something you can move through. At first, this requires effort, because the pattern is still strong. The thoughts still appear quickly. The pull toward familiarity is still present. But now, there is awareness. And awareness creates space. A space between what you feel and what you choose to do. Within that space, you begin to respond differently. You begin to act even when resistance is present. You begin to continue even when hesitation appears. And this is where change begins to take hold, not because resistance disappears, but because it is no longer controlling your actions. Each time you move forward despite resistance, you weaken its influence. Each time you choose action over hesitation, you strengthen a new pattern. And over time, this new pattern begins to replace the old one. The mind starts to adjust. What once felt unfamiliar begins to feel more natural. What once triggered hesitation begins to feel manageable. And gradually, resistance loses its intensity, not because it is gone, but because it is no longer reinforced. This is the key. What you reinforce grows stronger. What you stop reinforcing begins to fade. And once you understand this, you begin to see change differently. It is no longer something you wait for. It is something you create. Through repeated action, through consistent awareness, through small decisions that shift direction. And as these decisions accumulate, the pattern begins to transform. From resistance to movement. From hesitation to progress. From familiarity to expansion. And in that transformation, you begin to experience something new, a sense of control that does not come from eliminating thoughts, but from choosing which ones to follow. If you bring all of this together, a clear understanding begins to form. Your mind does not resist change because it is trying to hold you back. It resists change because it is trying to protect what it knows. It is trying to maintain what feels stable. what feels predictable, what feels familiar. But what is familiar is not always what is beneficial, and what feels safe is not always what leads to growth. This is the distinction that changes everything. Once you recognize that resistance is tied to familiarity, you begin to see it differently. You stop interpreting it as a warning and begin to see it as a signal that you are moving beyond what has been repeated, that you are stepping into something new. And when you respond to it in this way, your direction begins to change. You are no longer moving based on comfort. You are moving based on intention. You are no longer reacting automatically. You are choosing deliberately. And that choice begins to shape your experience, not all at once, but steadily, through repetition, through consistency, through the accumulation of small decisions that move you forward. This is how change becomes real, not through a single moment, but through a series of moments where you choose differently, where you act despite resistance, where you continue despite uncertainty, and over time, those choices build something new, a new pattern, a new way of thinking, a new way of responding, until eventually what once felt difficult begins to feel natural. What once felt uncertain begins to feel familiar, and the mind that once resisted change begins to support it, because it has adapted to a new pattern, one that is no longer built on maintaining the past, but on creating the future. And that is where real transformation begins. There is one final layer to this that becomes clear over time. The more you move through resistance, the more you begin to see that it is not permanent. It is conditional. It depends on what has been repeated, what has been reinforced, what has been followed without question. And because of that, it can change. But it only changes when your behavior changes. Not once, but consistently. Each time you choose to act despite resistance, you send a signal to the mind. A signal that the old pattern is no longer required. A signal that a new direction is being established. At first, this signal is weak, because the old pattern is still dominant. It has been reinforced many times. It has been followed repeatedly. But with each new action, the signal becomes stronger. The mind begins to adjust. It begins to recognize that the familiar is no longer the only option. That movement into uncertainty does not always lead to negative outcomes. That change is not always a threat. And as this recognition grows, resistance begins to decrease. Not because it disappears completely, but because it is no longer necessary in the same way. The mind adapts. It learns from what is repeated. And when you begin to repeat action instead of hesitation, the pattern shifts. What once triggered resistance begins to feel manageable. What once felt uncomfortable begins to feel expected. And over time, what was once unfamiliar becomes the new baseline. This is how transformation happens, not through force, but through repetition, through consistency, through the gradual replacement of one pattern with another. And when that replacement takes hold, something changes at a deeper level. The mind no longer works against you. It begins to work with you. It begins to support the direction you are choosing, because that direction has become familiar, because it has been repeated, because it has been reinforced. And in that moment, change is no longer something you struggle with. It becomes something you sustain, something you continue, something that becomes part of who you are. And that is the shift, from resisting change to becoming someone who lives it.